Hello and welcome to part 43 of my video series 90s Blender 2.7. In this video we're going to be continuing on with our facial rig. Now in the last two videos, in part 41 and part 42 of this video series, we created the facial rig that I have in front of you right now. Of course, if you want to go ahead and download the exact file that I'm starting with in this video, you'll find a link to that in the description area below. In our last video, in part 42, we finished the upper half of the character's face rig in order to control both the eyelids and eyebrows in different positions. Let's go ahead and check that out. If I zoom in on the face, and right now I'm in pose mode of my armature, of course I can grab the eye target and press G and move it around, but what you'll notice here is that the eyebrows also move around automatically when I move just the eye target, so that the eyebrows sort of move along with the eyes. That's done by creating shape keys. In the last video, in part 42, I covered shape keys several times. In this video, we're going to be moving on to working with the mouth and making all the poses for the mouth, as well as the tongue. Of course, if I grab the eye target and press G to move it around, of course I'm moving the pupils around, but you'll also notice I'm moving the eyebrows around back and forth. So when I move my character's eye to his right side, the eyebrows sort of look like they're moving in that direction too, likewise on the left. We also set up shape keys for the eyelids so that if I grab each eyelid and press G to move it, it'll only move up and down and only as far as it needs to go, but I can make each eyelid close independently or both at the same time if I select both those bones and press G. The eyebrows each have their own set of positions, so if I go ahead and clear Alt G, the location of the eye target, and I select the eyebrow bones, they both move together, and that's okay for me. If I press G to move them up, I can do that and move them down, and I can grab the middle of the eyebrows with that controller bone, and I'll press G to move it down or G to move it up, and you can see that it becomes angry or sort of upset. In this video, we're going to concentrate on the mouth and the tongue. Now, since the last video we covered shape keys and how to control shape keys using drivers ad nauseum, I'm going to concentrate primarily on just the opening and closing of the mouth, as well as how to get a tongue that you can animate using a squash and stretch rig with a few controllers in it for the tongue. So the first step, of course, is going to be to zoom in on the face, and by selecting the mesh of the character, we can go in and make another shape key to make his mouth open. Now I'm going to be going through in this video and fast forward other positions for the mouth, including moving his jaw to the left and to the right, and for all of those things, opening his mouth and moving his jaw left and right, we're going to be using this lower jawbone. Let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to go ahead and select the mesh, and I'll go over here to my Object Data tab, and of course we have this list in the Shape Keys area of the Object Data tab, all of my shape keys for all different positions for the eyelids and the eyebrows, but now I'll press the plus button, and I'm going to make a new shape key called mouth dot open. Okay, with that shape key selected, I'll press tab to go into edit mode, I'll press 1 to go to my front view, and I'm going to start by selecting the faces at the bottom of his mouth, and we're going to grab them and pull them down. Now it's really important at this point that I switch into proportional editing mode down here. Of course you can press the O key on your keyboard, which will switch it right down here, but I want specifically connected mode, because when I grab these two bottom faces, if I'm just in proportional editing mode enabled, and I grab it down, the whole mouth will move down. That's not what I want. I want only the ones that are connected to the faces that I have selected right now to move down, so I'll go into connected mode and move them down. When you have proportional editing turned on, of course, you should be using your G and then Z key in this case to move down, and you'll see that the top of the mouth isn't going to be moving when I'm pulling down, but I might want to scroll up or down to adjust how much I'm pulling down. So I'm going to really quickly zoom through this. You'll see me pulling and adjusting my proportional editing. I'll also be doing some sliding to get the mouth shape the way that I want it. Alright, so you might have noticed that funny things are happening with our character's lower gum. So what I'm going to do here is go into face select mode, and I'm going to press A, and A to select nothing, and I'll press L on my keyboard to select all the front faces. In fact, what I'll do instead is I'm going to hold, or I'll press A and hold Control and Alt, and select this edge ring around the outside of his mouth, so this one right here. Alt right click, or Control and Alt and right click rather, and then I'll press Control plus just a couple of times, so I'm just hiding the outside of the head and the lips, and then I'll press H on my keyboard to hide that. What's happening here is that when I pulled the lower vertices down of the opening in his mouth, because the face of the wall cavity, or in the front of the wall cavity, is just one face, it doesn't know what to do here, so it's sort of overlapping in a funny way. So what I have to do here is grab the bottom edge, or the two bottom vertices right there, and I'm going to grab them, pull them straight down. Because the jaw kind of gets narrower down here, I'm going to press S to scale down. Not so that I'm cutting it off like that, but you see funny things happen when you kind of mess with or skew n-gons, especially with holes in them. So that's what we have to do here. We have to deal with that by moving this edge down and making it smaller just to kind of fit around the outside of the mouth. Now, the important thing here is that we're not, and by the way, we're still working with the shape key, the mouth open shape key, we're not going to touch the tongue at all, and that's very important. We are, however, going to be working with the teeth. So I want the bottom row of teeth to move down, but I want them to do a little bit of rotating too, because when you open your jaw, your bottom teeth sort of rotate down. They don't just move straight down. So I'll press A and then an L on my keyboard with my mouse hovered over the teeth, and then I'll go to my side view with the 3 key, and I'll press Z to go into wireframe mode. Now I'm going to move the teeth down, keeping in mind how or where the bottom of my mouth opening is. So I'll press G and then Z on my keyboard, and I still have proportional editing turned on, but that's okay. I can move it down to right about there, and then I want to rotate them downward. So I'm going to actually put my 3D cursor right up here. It doesn't matter how forward or back it is, because we're just working from this side. And I'm going to change my pivot point, because right now it's rotating from that point right there to my 3D cursor. So my pivot point will be right there. So I'll do that right down here. Right now it's set to median by default, but I'm going to change the pivot point to 3D cursor. And now if I press R on my keyboard and move my mouse, it'll rotate just like that. That looks pretty good to me. Again, I'm not going to touch the vertices in the tongue at all, because I'm going to be creating bones for that object in just a few minutes. Also, I want to go ahead and move the top teeth down. Yes, when you open your jaw a little bit, your upper teeth become revealed, or at least I want his to become revealed in this case. So we'll go ahead and press A to deselect all, and I'll put my mouse over the teeth and press L, and I'll change my pivot point back to my median point down here. There we go, and I'll move these straight down on the Z-axis. Just a quick note here, when I was moving the middle part of his jaw down and playing around with both sides of his mouth, it's really important that, especially when you grab, and I'll go back into material view, when you grab the front faces, and I'll press Alt-H to show everything again, that you don't just press G and move it down to one side or the other. You have to press G and then Z on your keyboard, or just use the movement gizmo on your Z axis. So that's really important to do. That's looking pretty good to me. I might move the bottom teeth down a little bit. You'll notice that the walls of his mouth are cutting off his teeth, so I'll have to adjust those just a little bit. Let's go ahead and select that same loop or edge ring around his mouth. So Control and Alt and right click, and then Control plus, and then H on my keyboard. Again, the teeth are being cut off and they're a little bit high up still, so I'm going to grab that bottom edge, move it down, press S on my keyboard to scale it side to side, and I might move it up a little bit and then make it bigger, just so it's not being or poking outside the bottom of the jaw or the cheek. Alright, that looks pretty good to me. Maybe just a little bit wider and then a little bit higher up. That's not going to poke out at all too much. Maybe just a little bit there, but it won't come outside of the skin of the character once I unhide it. So I think that looks pretty good to me. Let's go ahead and Alt-H to unhide everything, and I'm going to press Tab to go back into object mode. Let's just see how that looks. I'm going to scrub up on this value here, or scroll it up, and you can see what's going to happen. I'm pretty happy with that. Maybe the teeth could be a little bit lower. So I'll turn that back down, press Tab to go into edit mode, still with that shape key selected, and I'm going to move the teeth down a little bit, A and L. I'll go into my wireframe mode, and I think what I need to happen is they just need to move down a little bit and forward a little bit too. Alright, let's go back into material view and check out how that looks. In object mode, we'll slide that value up again, and that's looking pretty good to me. Let's go ahead and attach that to a bone. So I'm going to re-show my bone layer, which I hid sort of in that time lapse by holding Shift and clicking on that second layer down there. And I'm going to select one of my bones and press tab to go into edit mode first, because what's coming up in a few minutes is us creating new bones for the tongue. And the tongue sort of has to follow along with the mouth when it opens. We don't want the tongue to be in the middle of the mouth when the tongue opens, but we want to have the tongue being controlled by some bones that we're going to be creating. Now the problem is, if we were to have created the shape key, including the tongue moving down, and then we put bones inside the tongue which control the vertices of the tongue, then you would have had a problem where the tongue would have gone way through the bottom of the head. Because when you magnify the influence of bones, and the tongue moves down, if it were to be parented to the jaw, it would just cause issues. You can go ahead and try it out for yourself. I don't recommend it. So what I want to do here is eventually I'm going to have some of the tongue bones pointed at the lower jawbone, but they're going to be pointed towards this lower nub, the head, if you will, of this bone. I don't want that head nub to be down at the bottom of that bone. I want it to be sort of in the middle. So I'm actually going to take this bone and rotate it negative 90 degrees from the right view of my viewport. So I'll press R and negative 90, and I'll press enter. So now it's looking pretty good to me. I might also move it out a little bit, because I believe when you make a bone shape, your gizmo will be located at the head nub of that bone. So I want to be out a little bit. Let's go ahead and go back into pose mode of our armature. And I need to set up the driver for this bone to control that shape key. So I'm going to make two windows in this big window. I'll grab this little crosshatch area and drag it to the left and change this window type to a graph editor window. Now, in the last video we covered how to set up a driver, so I'm going to do that very quickly now. I'm going to press N on my keyboard to bring up the other properties panel, and I'll go back to my mesh in object mode, and I need to go to my driver in the object data tab. And I'm going to right click on this 0.000 and say add driver. Once I've done that, it should... I have to go ahead and change F curve to drivers. I forgot that part. And here are all the drivers for the other bones. I'll select mouth.open, and that'll control that value. Over here in the drivers section, I'm going to select averaged value instead of scripted express. That's the driver type. I'm going to change the bone that we're going to be controlling with. So in this case, we're going to select a bone in the armature, and we're going to select face dash jaw, and it's going to be on its local, and we are in the local gizmo state right now. It's going to be moving down or positively on the Z axis. So again, with that mesh selected, it's going to be on the Z location, and it'll be in the local space. And once we do that, we have to update dependencies. That'll just solve that little error that we had. And I'm going to add a generator modifier, and as it's going positively on that Z axis, I'm going to change my coefficient for polynomial value up to +5. So now if I grab that bone and press G to move it down, it'll open. I'll go very quickly and adjust that. So if I go to my front view and press G and Z, the shape key is moving way too fast. I want it to stay with this bone. So I'm going to change this down to maybe 2, G and Z. That's looking pretty good to me, just a little bit slow. So maybe 2.1. I think that's a good number. G and Z. Just about perfect. So I'm happy with that. I want to limit the location of this bone. So I'm going to press N on my keyboard and limit it to just the Z axis locally. So I'll lock those other two axes. We will be adding left and right, so I will have to enable the X again, but we'll do that in a few minutes. Let's go ahead over to the Bone Constraints tab. Add a bone constraint. We're going to limit the location of that bone, so we can only move it up so far and down so far, or positively or negatively so far. Negatively, in the local space, we're going to be moving to a minimum of 0 and a maximum of, well, let's go ahead and check that out. If I drag it down to right about there, right about there. So on the Z axis, I'll Control C with my mouse hovered over that little area, Control C, and over here, Control V, and I'll turn that on. So now, Alt G, and I can grab this and pull it up and down. And why isn't that one working? Oh, I used the wrong axes. Ha! It was the Y axis that I was playing with. I'll make that wider so I can see it. So I'm just going to copy this one, Control C, Control V, turn these ones off, turn these ones on, because we're on the Z axis, not the Y axis. Silly me. I'll grab that and pull it down. It'll stop right there. It'll stop right there. So we're good to go. Next, I'm going to make this window narrower because we don't need it for a little while. In fact, I'll collapse that window entirely. We want to add some bones for the tongue of our character because when I drag the jawbone down, of course, it looks looking pretty good, except the tongue is still in the middle of the mouth. And it should be following along with the bottom approximately of the mouth. So I want to kind of stay with those teeth. Now, we could just do shape keys for the tongue. We could just make a few versions of the tongue, of course, in our object data tab of the mesh. And I could do, a tongue up for the L. When you make an L sound, your tongue touches the roof of your mouth. And I could do one sticking out, and I could do one going to left and right. But I'd rather have a total control over what my tongue is doing. So I'm going to add a few bones here. Now, the way we're going to do this is we're not just going to have, one bone for the tongue. And we're not just going to have 2 or 3 or 4 bones for the tongue. We're going to create a special setup so that you can squash and stretch the tongue, and it'll work out really, really well. And the tongue is quite a large object, and in fact, when your mouth is open, it can't actually fit through the front of the mouth as it stands because the tongue is just too wide and too blocky. Luckily, when we set up a quite simple squash and stretch rig for the tongue, when it squashes or stretches, it actually changes its width and height as opposed to its length. So when you stretch it out, it becomes narrower and shorter. So when it's stretching out, it keeps the same volume approximately. Let's go ahead and press 3 to go to our side view, and I'm going to select any bone in our armature, and I'll press Tab to go into edit mode. You'll notice that it snaps back to its normal position. In fact, what I'll do first is I'll press Alt-G in pose mode to clear out that position, and I'll select all the bones, Alt-G, Alt-R, and Alt-S just to clear anything else out. And I'll press Tab to go into the armature's edit mode. I want to add a bone to the tongue, so I'm going to put my 3D cursor right about there. In fact, what I'll do is I'll press Shift-C on my keyboard just to put the 3D cursor right in the middle on the X-axis. And then from the side view, I want to start a new bone in edit mode of my armature right there. I know it's centered left to right or on the X-axis because I just pressed Shift-C. So right there, I'm going to press Shift-A, and that will automatically add a new bone. I want to move the tail nub down to where this one is, so I'll press Shift-S, and I'll say Selection to Cursor. So now we have like a bone that's taking up no space, which is bad. So right away, I'm going to drag the tail nub forward. So this is the head, this is the base, and this is the tail. So I'm going to grab that nub and put it right at the tip of the tongue, which is right there. Just a note, when you press Tab to go back into pose mode or object mode of the bones, you'll notice that the nubs disappear, but the bone body itself takes up the space where the nub is up until the halfway mark in that nub. So you'll notice that here the nub goes straight about there, but if I press Tab, the bone expands out to where my mouse cursor is right now. So just to keep that in your head when you're moving and positioning and sizing out your bones. So I'm not just going to have one bone here, I'm actually going to have 4. So I'll press W on my keyboard and select Subdivide. And now I want to bring up my tool shelf, so I'll press T. And I'm going to change the number of cuts up to 3 to make 4 bones. Now, actually, I want to make this bone outside of the tongue itself. So I'm going to grab that bone body in edit mode and drag it forward so that the middle of that nub is right at the front or the end of the tongue. And I want these 2 bones to be the largest ones. They're actually going to be the ones that are controlling the mesh of the tongue. This one's just going to be a pointer. It's going to be basically the stretch target of this first part of the bone. So I'm going to grab this middle bone and move it sort of the middle, and I'm going to make it as small as I feel comfortable. There we go. Now, here's the thing. This bone and this bone are only controller bones. So they're not actually going to be influencing any vertices in the tongue. So I want to turn off deform for those 2 bones. So over here in the bone tab in edit mode, I'll uncheck deform like that. And I want this bone to be sort of a separate thing from its target because the target needs to be not connected or not be a child of this bone. Same thing goes with this one over here. So I'm going to select this bone and I'll go over to the bone tab, and under relations, I'm going to get rid of its parent. So I'll press this X. And now, as you can see, it has no parent. Same thing with this one. I'll press the X to get rid of its parent. Great, let's go ahead and name these. I'll select that bone. I'm going to call this face dash tongue 0, 1, and I'll press enter. I'm going to call this one face dash T target 0, 1, and this one will be face dash T target 0, 1 or 0, 2. And I'll select this bone, and this one was called face dash tongue 0, 1. This one will be called face dash tongue 0, 2, and I'll press enter. Now, here's the really important part. This controller bone is still a parent of this bone. If I select this tongue 2 bone, you'll see that it still has a target. If I make the side area wider, you can see that this bone is a parent of this bone, and these two bones are not connected in any way except being a part of the same armature, and these two bones are not connected in any way except for being in the same armature. What I want to do here is make this bone stretch to wherever this bone is. This bone is much like an IK bone. It's not actually going to be controlling anything, it's just a controller bone for us, the animator. So with this bone selected, I'm going to press tab to go back into pose mode. And then over here in the bone constraints tab, I'm going to add a constraint to the tongue 2 bone called stretch 2, and it's right there under tracking. So I'll select that, and I'm going to select the target, which is going to be this tongue target 2 bone. So I'll select the armature in the target section, and then the bone is going to be face dash, and I'm going to select tongue or T target 0, 2, and you'll see it move just a little bit. But the cool thing here now is that if I select this bone and I press G, the tongue 2 bone is being stretched to this bone's location. So this is going to be our controller bone, and this one will actually be deforming the tongue. Great, let's go ahead and do that with the first bone. So I'm going to select this bone in pose mode. I'll add the constraint again, stretch 2. I'll specify T target 0, 1. So it's in the armature, and then face dash TT, and then T target 0, 1. There we go. So now if I grab this bone and pull it out like he's sticking out his tongue, I can now move this one independently. So if you want his tongue to sort of go outside of his mouth and then go down, well, that's what you would do. You would put this one at the entrance of his mouth, and then this one would be downward. So there we go. I'll press A and Alt R and Alt G and Alt S to clear all the translation out. Let's go ahead and make these bones a little bit more appropriate in size. So I'll go back into edit mode. I'm going to select all of these tongue bones. So I'll select that one and that one and that one. We're going to make them shorter. So again, to scale bones, to make them narrower when they're B bones like they are right now, I'll press Control Alt and S. That's Control Alt and S on my keyboard. And then I'll press the Z key on my keyboard. That'll make the bones narrower. It won't affect anything else. It won't affect how they affect the mesh. And then I'll go to my top view, and my tongue goes from here to here. So I'm going to press Control Alt and S and then X on my keyboard. I'm going to make them about, let's make them a little bit narrower, but I'm going to make my two controller bones a little bit wider then. So I'll press Control Alt and S and then X on my keyboard to right about there. In fact, I'm going to make the tongue bones themselves a little bit shorter as well. So Control Alt S and then Z on my keyboard, and I'll make them a little bit narrower. So the tongue controller bones are larger, so I can select them easier, that one, and where is it? That one. But then the bones that are actually controlling the mesh, which I'm not going to be touching, are that one and that one. They're a little bit smaller in dimension. So how do I get the tongue to move along with the jawbone? Well, first I'm going to press Tab to go back into pose mode, or change my mode down here. And I need to start looking at where the jaw is moving. So I'm going to grab this bone and drag it down. I want that tongue to follow along with basically the row, or the bottom row of the teeth. To do that, what I'm going to be doing is actually setting a bone constraint to a few of the bones in the tongue in order to follow along with the jawbone. Now what I need to do here is I'll press Alt-G to clear out the location or any posing of the jawbone. And with the first tongue bone, I'm going to add a new constraint to it. So over here in the Bone Constraints tab, I'm going to add what's called a child of constraint. Now basically a child of constraint is a way of adding a constraint that's exactly the same as making this object a child of this object. In other words, the tongue bone a child of the jawbone. But with the child of constraint, you can actually animate parent-child and control the amount of force or influence that the jawbone will have over its child, the tongue bone. So with the tongue or tongue 1 bone selected, I'm going to go over to my bone constraints tab, and I'm going to add bone constraint. We're going to add a child of bone constraint. Now you'll notice that it adds it to a stack, kind of like a modifier stack, but of constraints. We actually want this child of constraint to be above or before, or have its influence happen before the stretch 2 constraint. So I'll press this little up arrow button, and that will move it up. Now the stretch 1 is below it. And I'm going to specify a target. In this case, I'm going to select the armature, and we're going to select the face-jawbone right there. So it's going to error at first. It's going to give you a very bad result. And the reason why that is because the value is, well, according to this bone, if I press N on my keyboard to bring up its location, locally it thinks that, or this bone thinks that, its location is 0, 0, 0. But when I add that child of bone constraint over here, it sees that 0, 0, 0 and tries to add it at 0 of the actual entire armature. So that's not right. So what I have to do here is actually, because we want to move the jaw only up and down, we only want the first tongue bone to be a child of the jawbone on the z-axis, because that's the global axis. This modifier or constraint only thinks about the global axis. Notice how it doesn't have an option for local or global in the settings for it at all. So I'm going to uncheck X, Y, and Z rotation, same thing as scale. And in fact, we only want the Z location to matter, so I'll uncheck X and Y. Now it's at this point that I want to select clear inverse and then set inverse. Now what I've found is that even though this modifier comes first, we want to hide the stretch 2 modifier, because that will actually put the bone way up here, but it won't be stretching, which I find tends to mess up these two options. So I'm going to hide for a moment the stretch 2 modifier by clicking on this little eye, and then I'll press clear inverse and then set inverse, and that will snap the tongue back down to where it should be. And so now if I select the jawbone and move it down, the tongue 1 bone is a child of this bone effectively. Now I'm going to go ahead and select the tongue 1 bone again, and we're going to show the stretch 2. So now I move the jawbone down. That back of the bone is moving down. It should stay with that bottom row of teeth. Let's go ahead and select that back tongue bone again with the jawbone all the way at the bottom. And as you can see here over in the child of settings, we can change the influence of the parent bone. So if I turn this down, if I just slide it down, you'll notice that the back of the tongue is going back up. So what I'm going to do here is change the influence to where I like it, to where the bone is in the right spot. So I'm going to change the influence to, in my case, basically at 0.28. I'll change that to 0.3 just to make things easier for us. Great, that looks great. So let's go ahead and add a child of constraint to that bone and that bone so the entire tongue moves down. So I'll select this bone. We're going to add a bone constraint to it in pose mode. We're going to add the child of constraint. I'll select the target, armature, and then face-jawbone right there. We are going to, and it does not have a stretch 2 constraint on it, so I can go ahead and press clear inverse, but before that I'll clear out my scale and rotation and X and Y axes. So now if I press clear inverse and set inverse, it'll go back to where it should. That's great. So now if I press Alt G, actually, you know what I have to do? I have to select that bone again, clear inverse and set inverse, and it'll go back to where it should. I should have had this bone back in its default location again. So if I grab that now, you can see it's going too far down. So again, I need to adjust the influence of the child of constraint on that middle target bone. So I'm going to drag it down, and it's going to be right at 0.47. In fact, I want it to be a little bit farther away from the bottom of the mouth, so I'll select that bone again and just tweak its influence to where I like it. Great, we got to do this one as well. So before I do anything to this one, I'm going to clear out the location of the jaw. Alt G, select the target bone for the tongue, and add bone constraint, child of, and I'm going to select armature and face-jaw, and we need to clear out scale and X and Y and Z and X and Y location, and it does not have a stretch 2 on it, so that's great. What I'll do is press clear inverse and then set inverse, and it should be all good. Let's move the jaw all the way down to the bottom, and then I'll select this bone and adjust the influence. The last thing I need to do to set up the bones, before we actually attach the mesh of the tongue to the bones for the tongue, we're going to make this bone point in the right direction. You might notice that because this one is just moving down and this tongue bone is connected to the tail of the middle target, and so it's going in a straight line horizontally in our 3D world, I want this bone to point at our jawbone at all times. So what I'll do here is actually select this bone, and we want to add an IK constraint. Yeah, just like we added to the elbow bones and the knee bones, we're going to be making this bone point always at this bone. So I'm going to select this bone. We'll add a bone constraint after child of. So we're going to add a inverse kinematics constraint, and we want it to point at the jawbone target. So my target's going to be the armature. It's going to be the face-jaw. And as you can see, it turns a funny color because it's mixing two different colors together, green and yellow, I think, so that's what color you get. But now as I move the jawbone, Alt-G, and then I move it down, you'll see this bone rotate to point always at this bone. It's not going to be totally perfect. This tongue will not be straight, but because it's a Minecraft, basically a very blocky tongue, I think it's okay, and I think it's totally acceptable. In fact, I think this bone should go be a little bit farther down, so maybe I'll just adjust that. There we go. So if I grab this bone now and drag it outside of the mouth, that's all good and great. Now I can grab this one and pull it out. You'll notice again this shear because, you know, this bone will always be pointed at the jawbone. So what I find is that I don't ever want to move this controller bone outside of the mouth. And if I want to, I believe I can. No, I can't rotate that bone at all. So there will be a little bit of a problem with the tongue, but it won't be that noticeable because we're going to do a nice fall off between the two influences of the two tongue bones. Let's go ahead and do that. So I'll press A and A, and then Alt-R, Alt-G, and Alt-S to clear out all the locations of all my bones. And I'm going to select the mesh of my character, and it looks really ugly right now. That's okay. In fact, I'll go back into Material View, because on the mesh, I'm going to go into weight paint mode. So I'll change it from object mode to weight paint mode. And what I want to do first is actually hide the head of my character. I only want to work with the tongue. So I'm going to go into masking mode right here for face masking, and I'll press A, and then L, and then L, and L to hide all the sides of my face, or the head. So I'll select, actually, I'll get all these ones, and then H to hide all that. That hid the inside of the mouth and the actual box of the head because all those are connected. I'm going to hide the teeth too, so I'm going to select or press A, and then L over the top teeth, and then H, oops, and then select the bottom teeth, L and H, and I think that's okay for me. Actually, I might select all the body as well. L, 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 H, and H, and H. So now we basically can see all sides of the tongue. That's great. I'm going to select outside of mask mode the backbone of the tongue, and then go back into mask mode. You'll notice that when you go out of mask mode, everything reappears again. That's totally okay. I'll go back into mask mode with that bone selected, and I'm going to start weight painting it. So I'll press T on my keyboard. We're going to set a weight of 1 for just this back row. So I'm going to paint with a radius of a little bit smaller, and I'm going to make, I need to press A and then L to get that all things selected because I'm in mask mode, so I need to have all these selected to paint there. Let's go ahead and paint with a weight of 1, all these back vertices. You'll notice that when the bone has color, you won't see the red properly unless you go somewhere where you can see that color above just the background color of your viewport. But there we go. My strength is at 1, my weight's at 1, so we should be all good. Now I want this to fall off very gradually, and that's how we're not going to be able to see that little error in the middle of the tongue where it's going to be sort of ajar. So I've got an influence of 1 on this back set of vertices. I want to turn down my weight now. I'll go to 0.8, I think, instead of 1. I'm going to paint this next row. Alright, I'm going to turn it down to 0.6. And then maybe 0.5. And now I might go down to 0.3. 0.2. Alright, let's go ahead and go out of mask mode. I'm going to select the other tongue bone, this one right there, and go back into mask mode with all the same tongue selected. I'm going to do the exact opposite in fast forward. Alright, let's go back into object mode of the mesh, and let's go and see how these bones work. So if I select the jawbone, and I'm going to drag it straight down, G, and then it'll move straight down. Now if I grab the two target bones for the tongue, and I press G to grab it, I can pull the tongue all the way out, and you can see that it also sort of gets narrower as it stretches out. I can grab this one here, go to my side view, I'll move it out to the opening of the mouth, and then I can move this one down. And as you can see, it looks like he's sort of, wagging his tongue out. And because we have that nice fall off, the tongue bends, you don't see sort of that ajar section there. So it looks pretty good. I can animate my tongue wagging around. That's all good and great. I'll press A and A to select all the bones, and Alt R and Alt G and Alt S. Right now I only have one pose for the mouth. If I grab the jawbone and drag it down, the mouth opens and I can close it. That's all good and great, but I'm going to select my mesh, make some more shape keys for the jaw to go left and right while it's still sort of in its closed position. I'm going to make the Minecraft character have like a pucker. It'll be more of a square pucker, and I'll make him roll his mouth inward to make like an M or an sound. I'm going to make the corners of his mouth go up on each side for different shape keys, and I'm going to show you at the end of this video what I've all done and how to make your smile turn into a frown automatically. Alright, so I've gone ahead and finished all the shape keys I need for the facial rig to be complete, and I've attached those shape keys using drivers to the bones. I've set up constraints for all of those bones, so now my facial rig is complete. Before I can show you all those expressions I can create, I need to point out that at the end of this video, I'm going to be showing you a few very, very crucial things that you'll need to do to this rig in order to complete it. Let's go ahead and dive in. I'm going to grab the jawbone, and of course, if I drag it straight down on its local Z-axis, I can make this mouth open. But I've gone ahead and I've created two jaw left and right poses, so I can close his mouth a little bit and I can move his jaw left and right. But of course, because you can blend together different shape keys, I can make his mouth open and move left and right as well. That's all good and great, but I'll leave that mouth open. If I grab one of these corner mouth bones, if I move it straight up, it's constrained on its local y-axis. I can make him smile on one side or the other because I made a shape key for just a smile on the character's left side and the character's right side. So you can make his smile uneven if you want to. I'll go ahead and clear that out, Alt-G. If I go ahead and grab the character's upper lip bone, I can only drag it out on its local z-axis. If I pull the bone out, it makes a pucker, and if I drag it in, it makes sort of a curled lip in shape for an M or M shaped mouth. Alright, so just a note here, if I grab one of the side mouth bones and I press G to grab it up, of course I can make him smile. And I made a shape key for both sides of his mouth so he can smile differently on both sides. If I select the mesh, I can show you those two shape keys, smile.R. If I grab that and pull it up, if I didn't have a driver on it, it would turn all the way up. To make a frown, to make the opposite, what I have to do here is change my min value from 0 to -1 or a negative number. Right now, the slider will only go from 0 to 1, and that will work. But if I change this min to -1, and I now grab my bone, and I move it in the opposite direction that my driver is set up for, in other words, if I press G, but this time drag it down, it'll do the opposite movement for all of those vertices that were affected by that smile. So as you can see, if I grab either mouth side bone and press G, I can move it down or on the local y-axis to make a frown on either side. Now, one very important thing I did here is I forgot to parent the tongue bones to the head bone. If I select one of the bones and press tab to go into edit mode, you can see now relationship lines or parent lines from the back tongue bone, and these are very important so that your tongue does not get left behind if you pose the rest of your character's head tilting back or forward or just turning to the left or right. So the back tongue bone, the tongue bone 01 and its target and the end target bone, or target 2 I believe it was, are all parented to the head bone in order so that if you select just the head bone and you press R and Z to turn the character's head, the tongue bones follow along as well. Also, with the character mesh, I had to add all the extra objects that we added after the fact. In other words, the eyebrows, the eyelids, and the tongue and the teeth and the inside of the mouth using weight paint mode to the head bone. If I select the mesh and I go into weight paint mode, you'll see that everything inside the mouth, including the eyebrows, the teeth, the tongue, the eyelids are all red. They are all weight painted to the head bone. That's very necessary. Otherwise, again, when you turn the character's head, his eyebrows and eyelids and pupils and tongue and teeth and the inside of the mouth will not follow along with the head. And that's very important. Now, last thing I did is I applied the subdivision surface modifier to my character. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, hey, doesn't the subdivision surface modifier make your mesh all smooth and rounded out? Well, yes it does, but what I did is I took advantage of the tools I showed you in tutorial number 33, and I'll put a link to that on the screen right now, in which I showed you how to make sharp edges on otherwise smooth objects. Now, you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, this is not a smooth object. It's a Minecraft character. It's very boxy. Well, that's true, but if you want to make his mouth smooth and not all jaggy, it would be a nice thing to have a subdivision surface modifier on the mesh in order for when you pull the mouth out to make a pucker, or you just have the mouth in a more natural open position. Let's say I grab that and pull it down and Alt-G to clear that out. To make the opening of his mouth more smooth and natural, it just helps to have that subsurface modifier on it. So if I select the mesh and go into edit mode, you're going to see a lot of pink edges where I mark the seams as creases. As well, what you can't see is all these same pink edges are also marked sharp, and so with the edge split modifier, these edges stay sharp, and the surfaces we don't want sharp, in other words, the faces around the mouth, which I've actually got ahead and hidden, are nice and smooth. What I had to do though, in order to make the opening of the mouth work, because it was made of one big N-gon, and I'll press Alt-H to clear out the faces that I had hidden, and I'll go ahead and select the edge ring and press Ctrl+ a few times, and H. The front face of the inside cavity of the mouth was causing a problem because it was just one big N-gon. Even though we have shape keys for all the different facial positions, I was still able to go back to the basis shape key and delete those two N-gons that were around the outside of the opening of the mouth. So now the cavity of the mouth only has its sides and back. It no longer has an opening, but that doesn't matter. We can't ever see that face, and it was getting in the way. It did not agree with the subdivision surface modifier. So I'll go ahead and press Alt-H to show the mouth again, and I'll press Tab to go back into edit mode, and I have a finished rig. So if I grab any of the mouth bones and grab them, I can only move them in the direction that they will work, and all the shape keys work really well together. If I grab the tongue bone, you can see that because I didn't mark any sharp edges or creases on the tongue, it's now rounded out. I can grab that end tongue target and press G and pull it out of the mouth, and as you can see, it's nice and rounded, although of course I can pull it in any direction, which I might not want in an animation. But that'll be it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.